Okay, thanks Maria, and thanks Kristen for setting all this up. So I'm going to be talking about a number of field campaigns that have been conducted in the Southern Ocean in the last couple of years, all of which are finished now. And before I start, I want to make sure I acknowledge all of my collaborators or conspirators on this work. So that is Chris Bretherton, Rob Wood, and Raj Marchand from the University of Washington. And both Chris and Raj are online today. Simon Alexander from the Australian Antarctic Division, Paul DeMott from Colorado State University, Alain Protat from the Australian Bureau of Meteorology, and Steve Sims from Monash University. So I'll be talking about a number of different campaigns that were both air-based, ship-based, and ground-based today. So I wanted to start off by giving a bit of motivation of why we decided to do these projects. And actually, a lot of the motivation of these projects goes back to a meeting we had at the University of Washington about 3 or 4 years ago, where we started to make all of these plans. And, you know, the main motivations are that the Southern Ocean, it's really one of the cloudiest regions on Earth. And the Earth's climate is very sensitive to the representation of Southern Ocean clouds. And we saw this during all of our experiments that mixed phase liquid and ice clouds and a lot of supercooled liquid clouds are present over the Southern Ocean, but they're very hard to simulate. They affect the cloud albedo, the sunlight reaching the ocean surface, and ultimately the cloud feedbacks on global climate. And one problem that we're finding in both the climate models and numerical weather prediction models is that there's too little cold sector boundary layer cloud, or not reflective enough. At the same time, another interesting feature about the Southern Ocean is that it's a very remote region. It's very remote from anthropogenic and natural continental aerosols. So this makes it a very unique natural laboratory for understanding cloud aerosol interactions in both liquid and ice clouds. And in fact, if you look at some of the previous papers by Carlslaw and Gann, they point out that one of the largest uncertainties in quantifying anthropogenic aerosol effects is the fact that we have a poor understanding of the pre-industrial state. And although we can't measure the pre-industrial state, the closest thing we can get to it is over the Southern Oceans. So questions are, can GCMs capture controls on the cloud condensation nuclei, the ice nucleating particles, and so on over the pristine mid-latitude oceans? And what is the role of marine biogenic aerosol? And the reason why observations really haven't hitherto been conducted over this area is that the harsh conditions make the Southern Ocean measurements challenging. So there's a lot of sparsity of past data. So just to illustrate some of these points, here on the left-hand panel, we're showing that the CMIC clouds, model clouds, do not reflect enough sunlight over the Southern Ocean. So if you look over the Southern Oceans and you look at this red color, this indicates that too much shortwave radiation is being observed by the Earth system. And these biases influence the circulation and may correlate with climate sensitivity. And where this is occurring, if we look at the right-hand panel here, we're seeing the cyclone composite, and this is indicating between all the different models here, patterns of insufficient reflected shortwave radiation in the cold, dry regions of cyclones. You're seeing that with the red color in here being very pervasive in these cold, dry regions of the cyclone. So you may ask, well, why don't we just use satellite data to look at this? Well, the retrievals of clouds, precipitation, and aerosols over the Southern Ocean, it's highly uncertain. You have problems with small solar zenith angle there, sun glint, and other things, and also a lot of the retrieval algorithms are probably tuned basing data from mid-latitude clouds where we may have more aerosols and the characteristics of the clouds might be different. So just to illustrate this, I'm showing here phase retrievals. We're showing the different percentage of retrievals from cloud phase from, say, Motus, Calliope, and the Dardar mask. And what you're seeing is if you look at the temperature range of about -5 to -20 or so, you see you can get very different retrievals in the amount of, say, supercooled liquid water or the amount of supercooled and mixed phase precipitation, or even the amount of ice phase can vary a lot in these different retrieval algorithms. And then another important feature is, before these Southern Ocean experiments were conducted, the small amount of data that existed, say in cloud droplet concentrations from earlier studies of Boers et al. In the ACE experiments, they're showing a high seasonal cycle, where in the winter months here, you tended to have lower cloud droplet concentrations, lower cloud condensation nuclei concentrations measured at Cape Grim, and also retrievals of concentration from MODIS, suggesting that there's a large seasonal cycle in both the cloud droplet and cloud condensation nucleation concentration. And biogenic sources are believed responsible for this seasonal cycle, but much is unknown about the aerosol composition and the underlying physical processes that cause this seasonal cycle. So now I'm going to jump right into talking about our Southern Ocean experiments. And there's really four different themes that we looked at in these Southern Ocean experiments. Theme one was we wanted to document the synoptically varying vertical structure of Southern Ocean boundary layer clouds and aerosols. We wanted to look at the variability of sources and sinks of cloud condensation nuclei and ice nucleating particles and the role of local biogenic sources in these seasonal cycles. We wanted to look at supercooled liquid water clouds over the Southern Ocean, and we wanted to improve our ability to retrieve the properties of these clouds, because ultimately whatever minimal data we collect during this time period, we're going to want to build up larger statistics using ground and especially satellite-based remote sensing. So with those overarching objectives, we had a number of overarching measurement objectives, mainly to characterize the physical properties of the lower tropospheric cloud systems around these mid-latitude cyclones. We also wanted to characterize, to the extent possible, the microphysical and chemical properties of aerosols and precursor aerosol compounds. And then in terms of using these data, we want to use these data to assess the quality of satellite cloud aerosol precipitation products. And then also, more importantly probably, is to evaluate and improve the skill of models at different scales to reproduce the observed properties over the Southern Ocean so that we can learn more about the mechanisms that are controlling the availability of the supercooled water over the Southern Ocean. So this schematic here shows 4 different experiments that have been conducted in the Southern Ocean in the last 2 years. The one we recently returned from is Socrates. This was a deployment of the National Science Foundation G5 aircraft. And basically we were based here in Hobart, Tasmania, and we were conducting flights over this north-south curtain, collecting both remote sensing and in situ data characterizing clouds really throughout the entire troposphere. At the same time as Socrates, there was a ship, the RV Investigator of the Australians, that was sailing in the region over the Southern Ocean. We conducted a number of overflights of the Investigator during Socrates, and there's also some data from Capricorn in 2016. Raj ran a program called MICRE out of Macquarie Island, which involves some ground-based instruments from the Department of Energy and also from the Australian Bureau of Meteorology and the Australian Antarctic Division. It was there for a 2-year cycle, making seasonal cycle observations at Macquarie Island. And then we also had an experiment called Marcus, where we put on the Department of Energy mobile facility on an Australian icebreaker as it made resupply voyages to the different Australian Antarctic stations. So that was conducted between 2017 and 2018. So for the next few minutes, I'd like to talk just a little bit more about these different experiments. So I'll first start with Marcus. Marcus targets observations of clouds, aerosols, precipitation, and radiation over the Southern Ocean. And as I mentioned, we used the Australian Antarctic supply vessel, the Aurora Australis, as it made routine transits between Hobart and the different Australian Antarctic stations. We installed the ARM mobile facility on the Aurora Australis, and it was equipped with an aerosol observing station for measuring CCN and INPs at the surface, And also there were a number of remote sensors for retrieving the macrophysical and microphysical properties of the clouds that were over the Southern Ocean. And of course, we also had measurements of radiation. So it just completed on the 23rd of March, and in fact, yesterday completed the final pack-up of all of the Marcus instruments, so they're now on their way back to the United States. And the major motivation for Marcus is basically measurements in cold waters and at latitudes poleward of 55 degrees south are especially sparse and climatologically important because of these GCM biases. And this is where supercooled and mixed phase clouds are frequent. So what is unique about Marcus compared to the other experiments is that we really have complete seasonal cycle, or at least 6 or 7 months, and also we have a lot more observations south of 55 degrees, where the aircraft observations don't get as far south. There was 4 different voyages. Unfortunately, I only have data from the first 2 voyages. So here I'm showing the ship tracks that were that were sailed for the first 2 voyages, and soon we should get data from V3 and V4, so I can update this figure. This is a picture on the monkey deck of the Aurora Australis, and you can see here a number of many different instruments that we installed on the monkey deck here, a number of different radiometers. I'm actually standing in front of the Aerosol observing system where this picture is being taken. But just to give you an idea of the different instruments that were on board, for active remote sensing, we had a 95 gigahertz radar, which was on a stabilized platform, which worked reasonably well. We also had a Lidar, a ceilometer, and a radar wind profile. In terms of passive remote sensing, we had an ARRI, lots of radiometers, an infrared thermometer, and a total sky imager. For in situ aerosols, we measured size distributions, optical properties, and absorption. We had carbon monoxide and ozone. And then meteorology, we had our standard meteorology instruments, distrometers, rain gauges, and we were able to launch soundings about 4 times a day. So just to give you just a small tidbit of data, here I'm showing for the first 2 voyages the probability distribution function plotted on the vertical axis normalized, and the liquid water path derived from the 2-channel microwave radiometer on the horizontal axis. And basically one of the things that we're trying to do is to determine what controls the distribution of various cloud and aerosol properties. So just as a small example of the type of work that we do, what I'm plotting here is similar plots where I'm plotting the probability of occurrence of different parameters that are plotted on the horizontal axis, and the different color histograms represent observations that were made for sea surface temperatures greater than 4 degrees Celsius and less than 4 degrees Celsius. So for example, here we show the planetary boundary layer height from the ceilometer, and we're seeing that the boundary layer heights are typically greater when the sea surface temperatures are larger. Then here we're showing the cloud top height from the cloud radar, and here we're showing for these first 2 voyages, we actually have a few more high heights for the colder sea surface temperatures, and this could be just a function of the different clouds that we sampled. Here we have the cloud base height from the ceilometer, again showing greater cloud base heights for the warmer sea surface temperatures. For the liquid water paths, we're not seeing a lot of difference for the different sea surface temperatures. And then here we're showing the aerosol concentrations and cloud condensation nuclei concentrations for the different sea surface temperatures. So we're looking at how these vary with a whole bunch of different variables. For example, based on the lower tropospheric stability, where the measurements were made in context of the frontal systems, and a whole slew of different variables. And we're also being very careful, at least for the aerosol measurements, to take out the influence of the stack. So we have to look at the, say, carbon monoxide concentrations, also look at the wind speeds and directions, as opposed to how the ship was sailing, to make sure that we're not sampling the stack and that we're actually sampling clean aerosols. So that's the type of work that's being done with Marcus. Because we have only half an hour, I'll move on to Socrates. Socrates was conducted with the G5 aircraft that is depicted here. And our main motivation in Socrates was to characterize, again, the clouds, radiation, aerosols, and precipitation along this north-south curtain using both remote sensing and in situ measurements. So what we're showing here is our typical flight track. So we would take off at Hobart, we would fly high, and we would release a series of dropsons to characterize the boundary layer structure. We'd also be measuring the clouds with our radar and Lidar. And then when we got to about 62 degrees south as our far southern point, we would drop down, and then we would fly a series of modules where we would sample the boundary layer clouds. We would go do legs about 500 feet above the ocean surface. We do legs just above the top of the clouds. We would do some ramp ascents and descents through clouds, and then we would also fly some constant altitude legs through clouds, just trying to characterize these variables. So just as an indication of some of the different probes that we had on the aircraft, we had cloud and aerosol probes, radar, Lidar, dropsons, aerosol, cloud condensation nuclei, ice nucleating particles, and then the investigator ship, which was making measurements below the G5. And we had about 3 or 4 overflights, I think, had quantities such as seawater sampling. They also had cloud and precipitation radars, Lidars, radiometers for measuring liquid water path. They also had SONs, surface met fluxes, and some ice-forming nuclei as well. So here's an example of where the investigator cruised during Capricorn in 2018. You can see that they got a lot further south than we did, although in some of our flights around between about 55 and 62 degrees, we did do a couple of overflights of the ship. So just as a couple of highlights, what we got from Socrates, we conducted 15 research flights. We got within about 400 miles of the Antarctic. And some of the view graphs I'm going to show illustrate some of our features that we got. We noticed an ubiquitous appearance of small-scale generating cells near cloud tops. We saw multi-layered nature of thin supercooled water with relatively large liquid water contents given the depths of some of the layers. We saw a very clean atmosphere with very few large aerosols above the cloud. We frequently saw very large sea salt concentrations near the sea surface affecting the cloud properties, and lots of supercooled water as cold as negative 33 degrees Celsius. So just as an example of the cloud top generating cells, this is from one of our flights on January 31st. And if you're looking at the radial velocity on the lower panel and the reflectivity on the upper panel, this is for about a 6-minute period. You see lots of these streaks of enhanced reflectivity, and also you see lots of small-scale variations in the radial velocities that we're measuring at the top of clouds. And these are very small-scale cloud top generating cells that we were measuring, quite consistently during these flights with our radar and Lidar. And some of the work that Bob Rauber and myself had done in wintertime cyclones, we'd seen these. And again, we're seeing them quite frequently in the Southern Ocean cyclones as well. Taking a look at the Lidar, here in the upper panel, I'm showing the volume depolarization ratio, which is this scale here, and our very low values here. These are typically corresponding to supercooled water. And on the lower panel, you're showing the backscattered coefficient with the enhanced values representing the occurrence of clouds. And what I wanted to draw your attention to with all of these circles is to note that a lot of these clouds, which are consisting of lots of supercooled water, are occurring in multiple thin layers throughout the clouds. And, it's really there consistently to temperatures as cold as about minus 33. And we were struck really with the amount of supercooled water and the cold temperatures that it's occurring at. And note that because the Lidar gets attenuated, you won't necessarily be seeing other layers of supercooled water that may exist even closer down to the surface. This is some of the aerosol measurements. I think this is a plot that Chris and one of his students put together. And what I'm showing is the measurement of condensation nuclei in the top. And look at the different scales. So above the cloud, you're seeing, here we're showing the flight altitude here. So these are measurements above the cloud. Above the cloud, you're seeing lots of small particles and very few large particles. So this is telling us something about the nature of aerosol particles and how they're being generated. And again, you can see that this is indeed above cloud data because you're not seeing any cloud droplets here. Later on, we're actually seeing some cloud droplets. So moving on, I did want to look a little bit about the what's controlling the cloud droplet concentration. So in this panel here, we're showing some of the ramped ascents and descents that we conducted through clouds during Socrates. So we've got altitude plotted on the vertical axis and the number droplet concentration plotted on the horizontal axis. And this is for a number of different flights at different times, and I'm also illustrating the different wind speeds here so you can have an idea of how much wind was there, because the wind, typically if we have larger wind speeds, you would expect larger sea salt concentrations because it helps to churn up the water. So basically what you're seeing is that low concentrations are common on many days, around, say, 60 droplets per cubic centimeter. In the green, the brown day with the low wind speeds, you're getting these very low concentrations. But you can see in some other days, like this red day, when the surface wind is high, you can have much larger cloud droplet concentrations. But it's also important to note that during the experiment, we did also measure some cases with high wind speeds that had lower concentrations. So it's not simply a one-to-one ratio of how the cloud droplet concentrations depend on the sea salt concentration. So we're going to have to try and better determine what is causing the variation in the cloud droplet concentrations, and also going back to the context of looking at some of the previous experiments that I showed you. And here I'm illustrating in this green one here, these green ones. This is showing where we had a high wind speed of 26.6 meters per second, but very low cloud droplet concentration. I also wanted to show a little bit about what some of the cloud particles look like. These are observations from the Phipps halo. This is an imaging probe that also gives a measurement of the scattering phase function. And what we would see, what struck me being on the aircraft, is a lot of times in terms of phase partitioning, you'd go through the aircraft and you'd see lots and lots of supercooled water, sometimes drizzle, and very few ice particles. And then on rare occasion, you might just see, very rare, 1 or 2 ice particles. So, you're getting a little bit of ice, but it's not causing the cloud to glaciate. And here's some other observations from the Phipps halo. This is showing a bit of elongation of the droplets that actually occurs in the tube of the Phipps halo. This is another plot that Chris put together, just showing some representative dropsons at different portions of the cloud. So here in this observation, flight day, we had observations at the front, in a shallow decoupled stratus, and also an elevated stratus layer. And then here are some pictures of what the clouds actually looked like. In the interest of time, I'll skip over that. I just want to show a couple slides on MICRE, which is an experiment that involved a collaboration between the Australians and the United States Department of Energy. The 3 PIs on this were Raj, Alain, and Simon. And here is a picture of Macquarie Island. And just to give you context of where Macquarie Island is, here is Hobart. Most of our flights in Socrates were going along this north-south track. The Marcus observations were typically going more towards the west. And then we had the MICRE observations here at Macquarie Island. Although I should mention, we also did a couple flights of the G5 out in this direction, also involving flights over Macquarie Island. So here is a picture that Raj sent me that shows a lot of the instrumentation for MICRE behind this fence here to protect against some of these types of creatures from interfering with some of the instrumentation. And then in terms of the instrumentation that was involved for MICRE, we had things like measuring upwelling and downwelling surface broadband, shortwave and longwave fluxes. We had a oscillometer for getting cloud-based heights and backscatter. There was a microwave radiometer for the retrieval of the liquid water path. There was an MFRSR for diffuse radiances, a distrometer for measuring raindrop size distributions, and also a simul sun photometer. And then the Australians also supplied things like the cloud radar, polarization lidar. Paul DeMott also had some aerosol filter samples, and there was some measurements of the aerosol concentration and SONS as well. So I wanted to stick with about half an hour, so there was lots of time for discussion. So I'll just finish up with the conclusions. There's lots of new Southern Ocean cloud and aerosol data with a good remote sensing context that are now available. The supercooled cloud is quite ubiquitous in the minus 25 to 0 degrees Celsius range. Usually mainly liquid. There's some precipitating ice, as in Arctic boundary layer clouds. Very variable cloud droplet number concentrations, often greater than 100 per cubic centimeter, likely but not exclusively due to the sea spray from the high wind. And as I showed earlier, we're seeing extensive free tropospheric production of the small aerosol particles above the clouds. Their role in shaping the CCN and cloud droplet concentrations is as yet unclear. Some of the data are already available. I think some of the MICRE data and the MARCUS data are now available. I think the Capricorn data, at least from 2016, are available. And the data from Socrates and Capricorn 2018 will be available within 1 year of the conclusion of the field campaign, just to give the science team some time to go through the data, quality control it, to make sure good quality products are available. So with that, I think I'll stop and open the floor up to any questions or discussion.